Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Abdi Latif Dahir, a journalist, a Kenyan, and a lover of literary festivals and books. I'm going to be a moderator for this session about radical acts of restitution. And I have three distinguished guests here with us today to discuss this topic. I'm just going to briefly read their bios, and then we're going to get straight into it. Chidi, I'll start with you. Chidi Nwaubani is the founder of LOOTY, is a visionary designer, artist, and tech practitioner. His contributions have been recognized with a Webby Award and has been featured in publications all over the world. As a member of Snapchat's Lens Creator Network, Chidi experiments with XR, AR to redefine art by providing captivating experiences. LOOTY's genesis reflects Chidi's vision to empower artists and reimagine ideas of memorializing history and culture using technology like blockchain and NFTs. Chidi is a member of the African Future Institute's Pinpoint, an archive of the top 100 plus innovative African and African diaspora practitioners created by Leslie Loco. He recently spoke at the globally recognized Doha debates and is currently exhibiting at the Venice Biennale. Kiprop Lagat is the Director of Culture in the Ministry of Gender, Art, Culture, the Arts and Heritage. He holds a PhD in anthropology and a master's degree in museology from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. His PhD thesis was on the memorialization of the 1998 Nairobi terror attack on the United States of America Embassy in Nairobi. And finally, Mumo Liku is a film and TV producer and a co-founder of Baru Collective, a multimedia content creation company working in film, TV, documentaries, AR, and VR. He has produced award-winning short films, documentaries, television shows, and he holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Daystar and an MA in Creative Enterprise from the University of Reading. Thank you all so much for joining me. I wanted to contextualize the conversation, and you all work in different mediums, academia, government, AR, VR, film. When you think about objects, artifacts, how do you each think about it? Maybe each one of you could give an answer to that. Chidi, do you want to start?
So from my perspective, or at least for LOOTY, and in creating LOOTY, it was more around the actual story of the artifact, right? So a lot of the artifacts that we have are in Western museums, and those stories have changed, because it's been recontextualized in a completely different place. So for me, the artifact is more around the actual story that we're telling within that artifact. The physical object, somehow it's changed its meaning in a way, it being outside of its home. And the question is, how do we then reclaim those stories back and start to tell those again? And my answer was to do that digitally.
I come from a material culture background, and therefore if you ask me to define an artifact, I'll say it is a tangible object produced by man, produced by human beings, mainly for a functional purpose. And in this case, we have objects that are used for cooking, we have jewelry, we have dressing. But besides that, we also have objects, or in the context of repatriation, I think archives, libraries come into the context. So I come from that material culture background, and therefore these are objects, are things that we made and use on an everyday purpose. And in the course of time in history, they gain certain importance, and that's why they end up in collections and museums.
Is there a timeline to when they gain importance, or are they always important?
An object can become important just immediately after being made, or as you make it, you have certain ideas that you imbue into the object, and therefore it doesn't have to have a timeline. You can make it now and it ends up in a museum. or an art gallery for that matter.
Momo?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with my fellow panelists. All objects have different meanings, and they have different, they are important to different communities and different people. And like Dr. said, once they are made, they begin to have meaning, even from the person, the artist who made it, or the person who made it, and for the community that they are meant to serve. So I think different objects have meaning from the get-go, from when they have been made. And from our context, you know, they gain different meaning when they enter museums. And for us, even as creatives and people who work at Baru, we still see these objects to have culture and meaning to the people that they were created for.
One of the work that you've been engaged in, Momo, was the documentary If Only Objects Could Speak, which is a 30-minute documentary, quite interesting. I would highly recommend that everyone watches it. And it was about investigating these objects that were in a German museum where, you know, even when you found out that this museum had sort of like stored, you know, thousands of African artifacts in the basement, you still were not allowed to videotape that. Could you take us through the experience of like why it was important for you to investigate that story?
Yeah, so as you say, the film is called If Objects Could Speak. Let me actually just say it right now. We are about to release it online after 4 years of touring to different museums and different university institutions. It will be available on YouTube next week, which will be Wednesday the 3rd. So if you go to our page, Baru Collective on YouTube, everyone will be able to watch it there. And so the film was really, really important to us because we had toured different museums in Germany, and we were all seeing all these objects from Kenya that we have no idea about, that we've never seen before, even being people from this country. And so it was important for us to start the conversation with the museum curators, just to understand how did these objects get here, who are they from, and you know, what's the history behind them. And with that, we noticed that they also don't know. They only have the dates of when the objects entered the museum. So we were able to look at 3 objects, one from the Kamba community, one from the Kikuyu community, and one from an unknown Swahili community. Though in the film you only see the Kikuyu one because that's the one we were able to gain more information and provenance on. But the Kikuyu one entered the museum in 1903. I'm sure none of us were alive then. Even many of our, you know, ancestors were not alive. And so they didn't have any more information other than the tribe and the date that it entered the museum. So for us, it became a question of how do we get to know more. And so we took the object in 3D and you made an AR of it and brought it to the community. We toured it within Nairobi, went to Murang'a, we went to different parts of the country just trying to figure out what the object was. And we were able to at least gain some information on what this object is, and you'll see it more in the documentary.
Yeah. And in essence, like one of the people in the film say that, you know, you took the soul of the object because the physical object is actually in Germany, and so I just wanted to quickly turn to Chidi because like you actually, you know, work a lot in VR and AR. And in trying to like digitize a lot of these projects, these objects, and we know that like there was a report a few years ago that basically said that about 90 to 95% of African objects are actually stored outside the continent. Could you tell us a bit about your journey in terms of like, you know, digitizing these projects and what that has been like?
So it's actually that report that you're quoting from was really the inspiration for LOOTY. Like I heard about 90 to 95%. And when we think about this, like 90 to 95% of all cultural heritage from Africa lives outside of Africa. Sometimes I think about this and I was like, if we were to flip that statement and to say 90 to 95% of all European cultural heritage lives outside of Europe, what would happen? Like what would they be doing to maybe reclaim and get their artifacts back? I almost felt like helpless in the fact that there wasn't really anything that me as an individual I could do. A lot of the processes are quite bureaucratic, legal processes, and they're not really running on like moral lines. Because if it was a argument of morality, you would have just given back what you took, right? So in that, it's just devising like a plan, and that plan was, well, why don't we just go into the museum and take it, right? So we actually did that. So myself and like my partner in crime, we dressed up like we were gonna rob the place. So if you see online, we had like balaclavas, masks, but even that was a kind of, it was a performance in itself. So the mask was made out of this Ghana Must Go bag, which was supposed to kind of talk about the travel and taking back. And we held the Ghana Must Go, went into the museum, and then the part of the heist was actually, it was a digital heist. So using LiDAR technology, then made scans of the Benin bronzes, and also later on the Rosetta Stone, and then used that as a canvas to retell that story again. And I think it was, for me anyway, it was very important that we went and entered the museum physically, because the story needs to be reset in a way, so that when you're thinking about the digital artifact, you're now thinking about the genesis of this story as a heroic act, like two people went into the museum and reclaimed, rather than, I think a lot of times when I think of the artifacts, there's a lot of trauma that's attached to them. You see like this sculpture in a glass box, and it's just silenced almost. The trauma attached to it is that you know that artifact was taken, and there's a lot of blood on the hands of the people that took that certain sculpture and whatnot. So how do we flip that story and take it into a heroic story? And at least in the digital realm, that's what we've tried to do.
Did you feel powerful when you were doing this digital heist?
Yeah, it
What
did.
did it feel like?
It was like almost like, if anyone's seen like Black Panther, that scene where it's my favorite scene in the movie where Michael B. Jordan goes in, and it was almost like that, but it was legal. Everything that we did was legal. I actually sought counsel of a lawyer before doing this, so I wouldn't get sued, and then went through the terms and conditions. And inside the terms and conditions for the British Museum, they actually said you're allowed to make 3D scans. But I think they didn't think of somebody like me going in and doing what we did. So it was just that act of taking. That act of, even though it was like a performance, it again was an actual heist at the same time.
Dr. Kiprop, there was an effort a few years ago to sort of like at least document and create an inventory of Kenyan objects that are stored in either museums or personal homes across the world a few years ago. I'm just wondering, like, in terms of thinking about that inventory, in terms of like, trying to account for what's Kenyan and is out there, what does that conversation look like when you're having it with museums, when you're having it within government, when you're having it with institutions?
Okay, thank you for that good question. But before I go to that, allow me to offer a different opinion on the notion that 90% of African objects are domiciled in foreign institutions, considering that we make objects on a daily basis and they are in use in our communities. I think what is in Western museums and the Northern Hemisphere is actually a smaller percentage. It's an argument that has been used for us not to value the objects that we continue producing and we continue using. Having said that, let me give just a bit of info on the question on the International Inventories Program, which was a collaborative venture between the National Museums of Kenya. We had the Nest and Shift collectives from this part of the country, and a few Western museums in Germany. We had, I think you'll forgive my pronunciation, Rattenstrott Jost Museum in, I think, Berlin, Welter Kultur Museum in Frankfurt. Those were the main partners, and the main idea really was to investigate Kenyan objects that are domiciled in foreign museums. First was to start with Germany, and the idea was to also do provenance research with a view to making those objects more accessible, more available. That led into the establishment of a database. This database contains about 32,000 objects from 30 different museums from the Northern Hemisphere, and 7,000 of those objects have been published online. Even institutions that you'd previously think they would not be open to having their collections known, the British Museum, for instance, they were part and parcel of this program, or they were approached, and as my colleague has said, they were willing to have the 3D images of those objects taken. The importance of that database is, it is important when it comes to the question of repatriation. An argument has always been advanced that because we don't know what is outside there, then we can't stake a claim to what we do not know. So I think that is one of the critical importance of this project, IIP. Secondly, it also provided an opportunity for provenance research to be undertaken on some of those collections. As Mumo has said, some of those objects have very little information. It's just the name and maybe where it was collected from. What it was used for, that one is not there. So through this program, we were able to at least undertake some provenance research on some objects, and we now know what they mean to us. Beyond that, I think another critical element that I may want to mention is it became very obvious that we do not have frameworks for negotiating for restitution, and this program then spawned the idea of establishing a restitution policy for this country. And I think as government, with the sector, this is work that is currently ongoing, and perhaps in the next couple of months, we will then have a restitution policy, which will then address matters of bringing back some of those objects in the Northern Hemisphere. Of course, I don't vouch for bringing back everything. I think we have to assess them on the importance to this country. There are some that by having them in some of those countries, they can continue to be our good ambassadors on creating linkages between those objects and the communities in which those objects originated from. So I think it is a discussion that is ongoing, and it will take a long, long time, but at least we are making significant progress. Thank you.
Great. That's actually news. Thank you. Mumo, without giving too much of the documentary, there was an interesting conversation that happens when objects were digitized and then brought back to Kenya, and whether it's within Nairobi or taken back to Murang'a, and there were interesting responses and reactions that came from the audiences that were looking at this object. Without maybe giving too much of the documentary, could you tell us maybe what surprised you and your team about the way either young people in Nairobi reacted versus the older generations in Murang'a reacted to the object?
Okay. Yeah, truly, we had so many different ideas of what these objects could be, both in Nairobi and in Murang'a. And I think one of the bigger things that came out was a comment that one of the young men in Nairobi said. And he said, "Sasa hizi vitu mulizigunduaje huko?" And this is something that was so interesting, because he was trying to understand, how did these objects get to that place? What were you guys going to look for? And then he says, "So mulikata lap mkenda huko mkapata hizi vitu." And for him, he's just trying to understand, what were you doing there? And I thought that was really profound for him and even other people to just try and understand, what are these objects? What do they mean? How do they get there? And even in Murang'a, a lot of people thought that the object was so many different things, the young, the old. And I remember one of the things most young people are saying is, please call an older man or an older woman. We know someone here who's 87 years. Can you call someone who's maybe 90 years old to try and tell us what this is? And so it was so interesting just to see these young people, they don't know, but they want to know from the older generation, what could these objects be? And there was a lot of information that we were getting. Some of it didn't. When you look at the object, you're like, okay, maybe this is not it. But just to have that conversation, I think is something that was very, very important for them to be able to see these objects that are from their community that they've never seen before was quite interesting. Yeah.
Chidi, what has your experience been? One of the pieces that you've digitized was the Rosetta stone, which is quite remarkable and beautiful and very prominent. I'm wondering what the process of digitizing that was like and how people responded when you showed them that.
Just a show of hands, does everybody know the Rosetta Stone? Or people? So a few people. So the Rosetta Stone is an artifact that's in the British Museum. It's actually the darling of all, the centerpiece of the whole British Museum. But originally it comes from Egypt, and it's very important because it was what we used to unlock the ancient Egyptian language. So it's not in Egypt, it's in the British Museum. And actually its real name is not the Rosetta Stone. Its real name is the Hajar Rashid. And it's from a town called Rashid, which is in northern Egypt. So in going to the British Museum and doing this digital heist, we then went and flew to Egypt and taken that scan and placed it back in its original position in the town of Rashid. And I think it was something that, especially for, a lot of the people there didn't really know what was, why we're doing this. Like the local news came and they're asking a lot of questions, but there was so much joy for everybody to see like this coming back, and it's something that's not just for now, but for the future. There was a lot of like school children that were there. They were using like the AR and Snapchat and seeing it. And I just saw this as, if we're thinking about radical ways of reclamation, I saw this as just a new way of us to interact with these artifacts. You don't necessarily have to have the physical there, but the essence of that can be taken, and you can still get that back and have a new way of us understanding the artifact.
There was an article about you in a certain publication called the New York Times a few years ago, and you said something that I want to quote, where you said you wanted to shift attention to some of the attention that these museums have monopolized to the digital space. A new landscape, you said, where laws have not caught up. No one is colonizing the digital space. It's like a free space. Are you worried that you might be denied that at some point, that the technology might not be as democratic, or that some of these institutions might actually start stopping people like you or Mumo from digitizing these objects?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think about that a lot. But I think as like an artist, it's not necessarily my job to find that like solution. But just to highlight this and start that conversation of, look, in the digital realm, we can now start to memorialize our culture and history in new ways. We can leapfrog over all of the colonial nonsense that's happened in the past and start to create new narratives. That's the conversation that I want to start to have.
Dr. Kiprop, like some of the arguments that are brought forward on this issue is that museums in Africa don't have the knowledge, the technology, the resources to quote unquote protect, keep, take care of these objects and artifacts. How would you respond to that?
Let me start by giving a personal experience. Sometimes back in 2006 or 2007, I had curated an exhibition of objects from the British Museum collections in Nairobi, and in the course of having a discussion with a journalist from the Daily Telegraph, he ended up capturing Kenyan curator says African objects are better off in the West, which actually speaks to the question that you've just asked. For the avoidance of doubt, I think that was I was misquoted, and of course, it is a position that I totally don't agree with, for the following reasons. Before these objects were taken from the African continent, they were in use by our communities. They knew how to store them. They knew how to curate them. Therefore, for somebody to come with an argument that we don't have the expertise, the technology to take care of them, I think that is a misplaced argument. Secondly, this country and this continent has trained museum professionals in all the fields, from conservation, education, exhibitions, taxonomy, name it. And therefore, I don't think that argument holds any water. So I can confidently state that we have the capacity, the expertise to take care of our own objects. Perhaps some people have argued that way because they've seen some artifacts that have deteriorated. All objects or all artifacts are not supposed to be stored. If you take the Tiriki mask, for instance, or the Kalenjin circumcision masks, once you have worn that mask, the ceremony is over. That object is supposed to decay naturally. And therefore, these are some of the arguments that we should be taking forth to dispel some of these negative notions. I think it is an argument to throw spanner into the works when it comes to our quest for repatriation of those artifacts. Those artifacts, especially the ones of national importance, cultural and sacred importance, those objects should come back to the continent. I think the how and when, I think these are discussions that we can have. But we also welcome collaborative ventures with our partners in the Northern Hemisphere to at least make these collections more accessible, especially in the places where they originated from. Thank you.
Great. I just want to follow up with one more question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Dr. Kiprop, yourself, you did your PhD on the memorialization of the 1998 terror attack at the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi. And I'm just wondering, given the moment that Kenya is in right now, particularly over the last 2 weeks, how we should be thinking about archiving this moment and objects related to this moment. I'm thinking about posters, placards, you know, all the artwork that the young people have produced on social media. How would you think about this moment when it comes to protecting and archiving these objects?
In my view, some of the objects, some of the artifacts, some of the artworks that are being produced as a result of what is going on in the country at the moment, especially there are some spontaneous items that have been created. Maybe just by attacking maybe parliament, somebody picked an item or picked an handkerchief, a white handkerchief, and drew something on it, made a statement on it. I think that captures the feelings, the trauma at that moment, and the history the instance, the history that happened at that instantaneous moment. And therefore, all these artifacts should be collected, documented, and properly archived. They are important for history, that is one. And then secondly, when it comes to issues of healing the trauma that occurred during this instant, I think in future, those who may have lost loved ones, those who got hurt, at some point in time, they become important in transacting the traumatic memories associated with the event. And therefore, I support their collection, documentation, and preservation. Just the way it happened for the August 7th Memorial Park. There are artifacts that were collected at that time. There are artworks that were collected at that time. And those are the collections that constitute the exhibitions at the August 7th Memorial Park in downtown Nairobi. And that is a space that families of those who lost their loved ones, their relatives, their friends, they go there to transact some of the past traumatic memories that they had, and from anecdotal evidence from some of the people who visit that place, it provides a healing moment. So it is important that they're documented and archived.
Thank you. Mumo, how are you thinking about this moment?
It's definitely been a traumatic moment for the country and for all Kenyans at this time. And I think definitely, as Dr. says, it's important to be able to archive this. And I think from my perspective, archiving also, I look at it from a wider perspective, not only from a museum perspective, but also from individuals and families and the larger country. So even the people who have these items, it could be the placards, it could be anything that anyone made, they are able to archive for themselves, to be able to keep them and to memorialize them, I think is also another form of archiving. And so I think it also helps us to remember and to see what happened, just so that as we move forward, we know that this happened and it's not something that will be forgotten, even for ourselves personally. Yeah.
And Chidi, how are you thinking about everyday objects, the things, as Dr. Kiprop said, that we continue to create right now? How are you thinking about, like, in terms of preserving, restoring, sharing those objects?
I think in modern day times now, the main way which we have, I guess, globally, of this process of like archiving is, or the one that's known mostly is the museum. But it's not necessarily the only way of you like archiving or documenting things. This can be done through storytelling. This can be done through the arts, through even like dance, even to see somehow like celebrations and festivals being a way of constantly documenting and archiving certain practices. So there's many ways that we can actually do this outside of the museum and taking things into a whole new context as well. So I think in the modern day, where we have a lot of things done digitally, like archiving things on social media and things like that, we can actually think of new ways as well in which we can do that. New ways in which we can actually start to like document, even though we do say like, once things are put online, they're there forever. But how about we recontextualize those things that we've like, either tweets that have been posted or things that have been put on Instagram? How do we like recontextualize them so they can be like the story can be told and archived in a different way?
Thank you. We're going to open the floor for questions. Do we have any questions? I think there's a microphone coming from that side. Can we get another microphone or maybe switch it on?
Thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. I really, really enjoyed it. Many different things arise, because as I walk down the streets of London and go into museums, I wonder when they were created. And of course, the money to build the building in the first place, we all know, came from here, and the whole slavery colonization sagas. And I like this idea of now presenting historical artifacts and culture and so on in a very different way. And maybe Africa becomes a complete trendsetter for how things can be done globally. I want to focus on the last point because, of course, it's what all the nation is thinking, and I hadn't even thought about how are we archiving what's happening now, because it's an ongoing thing. And yeah, what do people do? Do they take their placards somewhere? Like, what are they meant to be doing them? Are they storing them in their house, and then maybe someone's banging on the door, finding them there, and they're getting into trouble? Like, what is the plan about how we record this moment in history as it's evolving? Thank you.
Dr. Kiprop or Momo, or does anyone want to take it?
I think just based on what I've said, and that's a really good question, because I mean, if they are found with certain placards and things, it could land people in trouble. But then I think where we are as a country and as a people, certain fears have gone. And so in as much as we have this, I think, like I said, it's from a personal and a family point of view, where some of these things will be held by families to remember. And like Chidi said, there are new ways of also documenting where, we can create new artworks with them. It can be used to create a new piece of artwork that will be, say that if I'm an artist, I have this placard and I use it to make something new that I can also be able to sell or to be able to keep. And so I think it's just about opening up our minds, and also we are the Lit Fest, so someone can use the stories that have happened this week and last week to create new narratives within the literature point of view, I think, yeah. But it's still new. I'm still also trying to understand it myself, yeah.
And Dr. Kiprop, like, were there things that people did in 1998 that sort of like, you would like to share as strategies or tactics, or like, in terms of keeping a lot of those artifacts and objects?
I think let me first say that I'm not aware of any formal government institution that is currently collecting some of these objects and artworks. I think in 1998 as well, it is individuals and families that kept some of those objects in their own personal homes or archives. And when the idea of establishing that museum came up, there was a call, and some of them came out and brought the objects. And this is something that is likely to happen. But I want to agree with my counterparts that there are other ways of curating these objects through maybe festivals, through publications, through film, amongst other things. So I think it is this should stir our thinking in order that we explore other ways in which we can archive them without necessarily relying on the traditional museological ways of doing things, having the physical objects.
Thank you. Melissa, there's a question also.
I just wanted to add, I've seen a call out by African Digital Heritage online, on Twitter and Instagram, essentially saying, do share all the things that have meaning for you in this moment so that we can collect, gather, archive, and record. So keep an eye out for African Digital Heritage. I think, and DocuBox as well. Yeah, DocuBox
Fantastic.
as well.
Thank you. Melissa, you're going to mention that?
Okay.
I just wanted to point out that I disagree with Professor when he said that some of the objects in the Western museums can serve as our like representation to Africa cultures and all that, and going back to the concept of reciprocity, that isn't the same case here in our museums. I've been to the National Museum of Kenya, and there's nothing ethnographic or anthropological from other cultures. It's basically all drawn from all the Kenyan communities. And I think that idea of ambassador role is some sort of dependency that we have to rely on the Western and the Western spaces to take our cultures out there, and yeah, and also they also don't know what such objects hold. They don't know what those objects hold, like their relevance and all that. So yeah, I think it's a narrow sort of thinking.
I respect your position, and well, I think we are allowed to have different perspectives. Let me give you an example of the Kenyan rugby team jersey that is exhibited in the African Gallery at the British Museum. It speaks a lot about our prowess in rugby at some point, and perhaps some of those cases could speak to that, but I was not given a blanket statement that all those objects speak on our behalf. There are instances whereby they may create linkages with the originating communities, but I think the bottom line is I respect that position, and I think it is all right.
We'll take one more question, and then
I'd like to speak to the issue of social media and archiving fashion and visual artists. First of all, I think that, and first of all, T-shirts. I think photography is very important to archive because there are many artists, photographers who have visualized events as they've happened. Also, I think that fashion is very important. I'm surprised Anne didn't say something because I think, and other people who do T-shirts, because we see lots of T-shirts today and in the streets, and they often represent female beauties and jokes and who knows what, but they haven't necessarily thought of archiving historic photographs or historic events. I think archive people should think about fashion, first of all, T-shirts, and getting together with people who can produce them to share them and archive some of the best. Also, I think, so I mentioned that about fashion. I also, there's something else I wanted to say. Oh, the one person who has been very good at painting historic events is the late Serena Patel. I think you get in touch with her family because she specifically painted about historic events, even some early colonial events that are, I mean, they would be traumatizing in themselves. I think those are the main things I wanted to say. I think there's something else, but I'll have to share it. So there are, I think during 2017, 2007-8, after the, after the elections in 2007 and then follow up in 8, there were painters encouraged through Romoma, which is now called One Off Gallery, and they were doing paintings related to those events. Of course, there's a book by Boniface Mwangi who should be archived. So I think there's lots of social media that can grow into archiving material.
Thank you, Margareta. Yeah. And I do agree, yes, the fashion of these protests, the drip was some of the best I've seen anywhere. Yes?
Sorry, I don't want to hog the mic for too long, but as a fashion designer working with my daughter, I want to now Yes, I've been approached actually by a Kenyan who lives in Oxford and works in a museum. She's told me how to start documenting and archiving, because I've kept stuff since '96, be it the whole inspiration of collections, the drawings, the samples, the photo shoots, etc., etc. And I think, you know, I wasn't even aware that these could be important things of documenting social change or whatever we want to document through it, and people's appreciation of culture and beauty and how that's changing. So maybe there also needs to be a bit of effort made informing the community, what do we need to do? And then, yeah, as you said, the drip in the protest has been a key point, and I work with a lot of young designers, and many of them are streetwear designers. And it also ties into the previous conversation we had about language in Sheng, because that's also being used within the clothing. So yeah, it's all part of one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're right on time. Chidi, Dr. Kiprop, Mumo, thank you all so much. And thanks all for coming out and for a fantastic conversation.